Hey everyone, welcome to a theory breakdown. Now, in a previous video, I talked about exposure, but as usual with the Alex Chow way, I don't think I described it too in-depth and properly, as I usually do these without a script, and more advanced topics could be a bit harder to extract the information necessary for people watching this to understand. So I wanted to focus on exposure, particularly. And I wanted to dedicate a video on this because it's often something that is extremely misunderstood. It's also something that is more in the subconscious and people don't really think about it. And people tend to create scenes and create artwork that isn't exposed properly, but they don't know why. So I'm here to really describe and really explain it, even though in the end you would have to practice and really observe reality to really understand it. This is something that, again, we have to use our human eyes to really get adjusted into what is feasibly possible for us to see in reality. So, one thing our eyes do, our pupils will expand and shrink based on what is required for an environment. And the reason why we do that is we actively adjust the light levels in order to protect our eyes from damage. Obviously, if you just look into the sun directly, it doesn't matter what your eyes do, you'll probably just get blind from it. But in general, in most cases, we can adjust properly and we'll get them in order for them to really adjust to a scene. So one thing is, amateur photography tends to mess up exposure on what our eyes could see. Too bright or too dark. And what I mean by this is, when you take a bad photo with bad exposure, it would look like your eyes haven't adjusted to the scene yet. Remember, our eyes will change based on how much light it needs to take in order to register the environment around you. So if you go to a dark basement, eventually you might be able to see a lot of the stuff in the basement, despite the fact that when you first enter the basement, that everything might just seem pitch black. And this is a very good example of what happens when you let your eyes adjust and what happens when you have good exposure. So, of course, this is something I say every single time. No matter what style you're going for, we tend to create scenes that we have to believe in. So it's best to understand the limits of the human eye and what is feasible for a human eye to see. And one big warning, when you are studying a lot of artists, they take liberties on exposure. This is something a lot of concept artists especially do, and that's not to say it's their fault. The reason why is concept artists, they have to show a lot of certain things. They can't really hide environments because, of course, as the name implies, for concept art, you need to show the designs for 3D maulers and other people in the studio to be able to create their game with. So you need, basically, I'm saying concept art's purpose is to show as much as they can, but that's not necessarily how the human eye works. Our human eyes are very selective on what we see, which means that concept art could, not always, could break the rules of exposure for the sake of doing its job. So I will start analyzing 3 different artists here who are masterful at creating perfect exposure while keeping a very appealing picture. And they're all different styles as well. So first, going back to Casey Balg. Now, Casey's work is obviously super realistic, but one particular thing is, even in his value work, his black and white work, you notice that it seems like our eyes could possibly see this. The scene is adjusted with the notion that the sun here, based on the sky rather, right here, and we can see everything else because the scene is adjusted to the skylight. The skylight is turned into just a simplified lit area, and it raises up. He raised up the values of everything around it. And what I mean by this is, let's say you're going into the scene, you took off your blindfold, you might see something like this. It's completely possible that you would see something like this. Because if your eyes are not adjusted, the light of the sky is obviously brimming. And what I mean by that is it's glaring. I mispronounced that, but it means that everything else in the scene is going to be darker in comparison to the sky. So this is what happens when you underexpose, when your eyes haven't properly adjusted. Of course, you can go the other way as well. You can go super overexposure. This is what happens when maybe you went into a dark room and then you teleport immediately into the sky lit environment. This is going to be what's happening. And as your eyes start slowly adjusting back to normal, you end up with Casey's work here. And this is something to note. Obviously, there is a range of exposures that is possible and that is appealing. That's not to say something like this wouldn't work. In fact, this particular underexposure would be great for certain moods. Again, there is a range of what is possible for you. So as an artist, you have to choose how you want to go about the scene. If you start going into this, we start going to horror territory, which is, again, technically possible, but it just looks like a mistake. And it looks like your eyes haven't adjusted properly. So find the middle ground, find something that in the middle ground that works for you, and you have yourself great exposure. Now let's go into Casey Boggs' other work here. Again, adjusted based on now artificial light. So this is obviously a night scene. You see back in the back, it's adjusted to the light of the cars for sure, and obviously there's a street light, yellow street light here as well. Fantastic work by him. Again, if we are to play with the exposure levels, we could go into something like this if we want a certain mood, where we start to obscure her face. We could even go, if we start going too dark, then obviously it just looks like we haven't adjusted the scene. We can go into lighter territory as well. This is still feasible. This is still gonna work. It's a little bright on the bright side, but let's say we go into this area. Now this is starting to look like amateur photography, and you don't want that, and we could even exaggerate like this. So again, find the middle ground. This is something, again, middle ground is a little bit hard to describe, a bit arbitrary, but trust me, if you study enough, if you are aware of it when you're doing observational work, eventually you'll be able to adjust your eyes and understand what is possible for the human eyes to see here. Let's go into an illustrator, Ate Galen. Now, this is where I talked about exposure in a video where I analyzed his work. But in this particular case, similar to Casey Boggs' work, he adjusted based on the light of the signs here. And of course, we can still make out what are the characters here. Of course, the buildings here as well. Let's start to exaggerate a bit if we underexpose the scene. So this is starting to look very cyberpunkish, and you probably would do this for certain types of moods, it still works. But in this particular case, Gaylon adjusted to a middle ground, and we could go even deeper like this. Again, it could work, but it looks like a mistake if you go too far in. Now let's go to the other side. Even this would work. It's as if the light in the scene is adjusted so the sky still looks like it's maybe in a midday type of thing, a rainy sky. But if we go too far out, even something like this looks like it's sunlight type of thing. But if we go like this, then we start hitting territories of wrong exposure. And again, find your middle grounds. Choose a middle ground that works for what you're trying to say. What am I doing? Reset. And you have yourself a pretty picture without breaking logic. This is well adjusted, and it says what Atay wanted to say. Let's look into another environment, but same artist, Atay. Look into the fact that now we are adjusting based on the sunlight hitting the building here. Everything else obviously has to darken to compensate for the fact that the light is brimming bright due to the sun. Now, of course, you can always exaggerate it, so this would still work. It's starting to get a little dark. It's a little bit weird now. We're hitting territories of not adjusted properly when we hit this point. Obviously a little exaggerated, but you know what I mean. This actually, the way I look at this now, this is something when people make exposure mistakes, they tend to make it look like this, and it's not good. It tends to look like this, and you'll find this a lot on DeviantArt, trust me. So let's look into the brighter end. So if we wanted to make a more lighthearted image, we could maybe go for something like this. It still works properly, but we start hitting territories like this, and it still works, but it's a little bit too much, and there's overexposure. So again, find the middle ground, find something that your style caters to, and you'll be fine. Let's look into the final artist, and Jeremy Mann. His work is very impressionistic, very painterly, which is why I love how he takes the fundamentals of lighting and bring it into his work. Very sketchy, very movement-based. So obviously this is adjusted based on interior scene. Adjusted based on the fact that her dress is white, lit by interior lighting. Let's use a different color. So again, if we were to darken this like crazy, this could still work if you are trying to make her look like a horror film. Still possible. This is something that could work if you were just entering the scene for the first time. But once we start hitting underexposure levels, this is where we hit amateur ranges of values. Of course, we can go into the brighter end as well. This it's still a little bit dramatic, but still, it's starting to hit bright territory. Now, this could still work if you are trying to overexpose the bright lights of the scene, but then we can start hitting this point where the contrast starts looking a little bit too washed out. This is something you might see in really amateur photography. Just Google that. You'll find what I mean. Now let's look into a completely different environment. Look into the night scene, adjusted based off of the artificial light over here on the back. And obviously, this is a night scene. He chose to hide the information of the top skyscrapers, make it simplified, dark, which helps the movement of this piece. And this is, again, an artist's choice, but at the same time, he's not breaking rules. If we were to make it like this, we start hitting underexposure levels. It still has a certain appeal to it. Obviously, it looks pretty cool, but it's losing too much information. So there's one thing I need to really mention. As an artist, we want to choose based on what information we want to tell people. So This comes down to style, this comes down to content. So be very careful about how you choose your exposure, because like the name implies, you are choosing the exposure to expose certain information and hide others. So this might be hiding too much information. This might be showing too much information, if that makes sense, when we go into overexposure. So find the middle ground, find something that you want for your style, and you hit this, and it looks completely fine, doesn't break the rules, and it makes the composition really nice for his particular style. Let's look into a final piece of his. We looked into artificial lighting, so let's look into his take on natural lighting. So obviously adjusted with the sky, with the sun here, but he made sure that the sky is similar with the midtones of the buildings and the the man-made stuff here. This is again an active choice, less exaggerated once more. It could be adjusted like this when it comes to our eyes, where again we're seeing the sky directly, which means that the sky and the sun are really strong, which implies that everything else has to be darkened. But this is hiding too much information, and it just looks like our human eyes were not adjusted properly. You can even do something like this. Is a very good middle ground here. You could feasibly make a scene that looks like this, and it would still work logically, and it's still appealing. But when we can go into crazy territory. Actually, no, this still looks pretty good. It's as if we want to show more, we want a brighter mood. Of course, Jeremy Mann is a very dark, very grim type of impressionist artist, so it wouldn't work. Of course, you can even you start to hit into overexposure territory. Now this starts hitting, this again could be what you see, but it just looks like we're not adjusting properly. So again, we have to be very careful about our exposure levels when it comes to our art. It's directly tied to light hierarchy, which is my first theory breakdown video. But I think it's worth creating a video just for exposure directly, because it's more than just having the right light hierarchies. You could have the right lights and values, but on the wrong exposure for your particular scene, which makes it look less appealing, and it probably hides or probably ruins the scene that you want to try to create. So make sure you know what you are doing. Do it deliberately, and of course make sure things are realistic no matter how we go about our art when it comes to style. Anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.